without further ado, Tristram Hunt, currently newly appointed director of the V&A, but of course is a very well-known historian of empire, of cities, and of Frederick Engels. And he wants to talk to us about collections, I think, in the
yes.
new road. And he's going to show us some pictures from his new life. I didn't mention the old life.
The old life.
Yes, so here you go. And you want to have
oh, I love this one.
yes.
Tipu Sultan.
Just leave it that. I just don't want to risk anything.
You can go full screen.
We could go full screen, that we could go, because I don't work with.
Is that
I
one?
work with Macs.
It's
Full screen.
this one there.
Yes. Yes.
There we are. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to have kept you. There was a trespass, as I said, at Letchworth, trying to get out of Letchworth. As Shruti said, I'm currently with the enormous privilege to be the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. What I thought I'd do is just show a few parts of our collection along this kind of notion of empire and Brexit, and also sort of say what's interesting about the V&A is, in a sense, the multiple causes behind its foundation, which are both British, European and extra-European, and it sort of contains these multiple forces. It was Roy Strong, one of my great predecessors, who described the V&A as the nation's favourite handbag. And it has been described as a capacious attic, where you kind of throw in everything you're not quite sure about. But there were some very, very sort of structured foundations to the Victoria and Albert Museum, or the South Kensington Museum as it was originally established. And one of these was the East India Company Repository. The East India Company Repository was established in 1799. Really, just as kind of Napoleon was establishing the notion of imperial collecting in Egypt, the company began to think about sort of establishing its own sort of narrative of collecting. And the highlight of the East India Company Repository collection, which then became the India Museum, which then formed part of the South Kensington Museum, was this, which is Tipu's tiger. And this tiger, this man-eating tiger organ, as it was known, depicts the tiger, which is India, decapitating a European soldier, which is Britain. And if you wind up the organ, you hear both the growls of the tiger and the shrieks of the man together. And then when this arrived in London, this was the absolute artifact to see. And in a sense, this is a story of sort of Orientalism and the other and all the rest of it. But when you begin to unpick it, it becomes incredibly interesting, because what Tipu's tiger is about is actually how very modern and European Tipu Sultan was as a ruler of Mysore in the 1780s, 1790s. And what is so interesting is that this was designed for Tipu by a French engineer depicting the decapitation of a British officer. Because the reason why the British stormed Seringapatam and had to defeat Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, was really because of the fear of a French alliance with Tipu Sultan. And Tipu himself was a collector. So this notion of the British and the French and Europeans as the establishments of these sort of collections, actually Tipu was a collector, and he was bringing in great artifacts and literature and art into his own collection. And when the storming of Seringapatam took place, this was a kind of orgy of theft. Not only the riches, but also the artifacts. And out of that really comes into British circulation some of the most exciting artifacts from the East India Company and from the British in India. And the tiger was at the absolute heart of it. But it seems to me to immediately kind of complexify the story of collecting, to make more complex the story of British, Indian, European interaction, and how we think today about how we present this story of Britain in the world. And actually what we were doing was beginning to collect as others had collected in India. We also contain at the Victoria and Albert Museum riches from the storming and burning of the Summer Palace. And the kind of sort of revenge element of this was always much more aggressive in a sense than the interaction with Tipu Sultan. And the Victoria and Albert Museum has an incredible collection of South Asian, East Asian and Southeast Asian artifacts. And actually you almost had this colonial carve-up between the great museums, in that the British Museum kind of got Africa. That was their sort of reign. And the Victoria and Albert Museum, because of the East India Company repository, had South Asia and Southeast Asia. And so we have phenomenal collections in terms of textiles and fabrics from India, but also artifacts from Burma. And what's very interesting is that we were then gifted back from the Burmese government some of the artifacts that were in our collection prior to Burma becoming independent. But with our Chinese and East Asian collections, our Chinese and Japanese collections are remarkable. What is interesting, and we can discuss this further, is that, you know, despite having Shashi Tharoor in the museum only a few months ago, denouncing us across, you know, the entire suite, actually the demands for restitution or restoration of many of these artifacts is not there. Actually, the conversation between ourselves, India, China, in terms of our history of collecting of these items is not a sort of challenging or difficult conversation. And what we do at the museum is, and I'm very sort of strong on this hopefully, is to have an autopsy approach to the history. That everything should be on the table. So you not only have the account of the artifact and the item, but you have the story of the account of the collection and the nature of the collection. And I think we're more and more interested in the sort of narrative of the item coming into the collection and its meaning. One of those stories, and a more challenging story, is our Ethiopian collection. As I said, we don't have a very big, we have a very small sub-Saharan collection, but we have an interesting Ethiopian collection. Actually, we're discovering more of our Egyptian collection. And these came into the hands of the Victoria and Albert Museum in the aftermath of the Magdala raid of 1868. And items went into the hands of the British Library, the British Museum, and the Victoria and Albert. And they are works of great beauty, of gold work. And we had the Ethiopian ambassador in the museum recently to look at these items, because we're coming up to the anniversary and we want to think about how we present them. And what was interesting about that was that we have previously had claims for restitution, and we returned items the V&A returned items to Ethiopia in the past. And we are not sure what has happened to those items. At the moment, there is no outstanding claim on these items, but quite rightly, the ambassador said to us, well, what are you doing with them? You know, what story are you telling? What prominence do they have? Some of these items are almost kind of lost within our sacred silver galleries. And so it seems to me there are two interesting elements. One is the kind of autopsy point about putting it all out there and describing the colonial past through this. But also thinking about diaspora communities today and the role of encyclopedic museums. That do we, as the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, have a responsibility to diaspora communities in Europe in terms of the presentation of historical artifacts, or is our only responsibility, as it were, the return of artifacts, which in some situations we do not know what then happens to them. And it seems to be a kind of interesting area for discussion and debate. Either way, what we want to do is not only have a bigger sort of exploration of these artifacts, but then think about contemporary Ethiopian artists and how they reflect on this past and how they interpret it today. So we have multiple sort of extra-European components in the building up of a great British collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. But we also have a very, very strong European story, that the V&A was the vision of Prince Albert, and not least the circle of reformers around him, of whom Gottfried Semper, a refugee from the 1848 Continental Revolutions, who finds a home in the reforming circle around Prince Albert, believes that what Britain needs are museums along the continental model. Semper always said that museums are the true teachers of a free people. And the purpose of the South Kensington Museum was, on the one hand, this idea of catching up with French, German and American competition in the aftermath of the Great Exhibitions and teaching design in the 1850s and 1860s, but also this notion of teaching a free people, that museums and public institutions in an era of growing democracy and an urban citizenry, that, you know, the teaching of our future masters had to happen not only through an educational system, but also through a series of museums and civic institutions. And so we had, as I say, this kind of extra-European footprint, but also a strongly European purpose behind our founding. And I love the idea of all these 1848 radicals finding refuge with Albert in Kensington, and then creating the South Kensington Museum. Finally, here's an interesting story, but I think it's interesting. The British Embassy in Tehran, we're collecting in Iran in the 1870s and 1880s, mainly through buyers connected to the construction of the telegraph system in Iran at the time. And so we've got these people crisscrossing the country, and it's a sort of, it's us versus the French as to who can get to the tiles quickest. And we go kind of toe to toe. And we're beginning, and the power of kind of Persian art and Iranian artifacts in the mindset of the South Kensington Museum in the 1870s, 80s is phenomenal. William Morris, our great kind of spiritual guru, he was obsessed and adored Persian art and artifacts. And one of our earliest and greatest acquisitions is the Ardabil carpet, which we buy and we still have the receipt for in the 1880s. This, you know, absolutely stunning 1500s carpet. But then the architects in the South Kensington Museum are called upon by the British government to design the new British embassy in Tehran. And what you see is this then incredible sort of mix of Italianate, Mughal designs, and in the heart of it is what I think was sort of terribly described as kind of the Oriental Room or something. But the V&A was in Tehran last week, and we're renaming this room the Wild Room. It has a hint of rumpus about it, but it's also designed by James Wilde, who was the architect at South Kensington Museum, and then goes out to Iran to design this. And these sort of flat, almost arabesque designs are taken from Cairo in the 1830s. And so you have the kind of utilisation by South Kensington architects of indigenous Cairo designs to place upon a British embassy in Tehran as almost, I mean, just as Lutyens would do with British architecture in New Delhi, sort of stressing almost the naturalness and the innateness of the British in this landscape. It is interesting that that the embassy was stormed in 2011 when sanctions were introduced, and they charged it. And they started slashing the paintings. So they slashed Queen Victoria and they slashed George V. But they were quite sort of, you know, they didn't slash the Mughal art. They didn't slash. They were quite sort of choosy about which artifacts to deface. And what's also amazing is that the footprint of this embassy and residence in the heart of Tehran, still this vast park there. So my kind of point about this rather rambling collection of pictures is that the V&A, European and extra-European, and then actually as a kind of exchange mechanism for some of these ideas around the world through the footprint of the British Empire. And today, what is our purpose? Today our purpose is, in an era of kind of Brexit and debate about this, to celebrate the principles and values of cosmopolitanism, to be a place for cosmopolitan exchange, adaptation and interaction, to explain the kind of multiple layers of interaction, adaptation in the story of our culture, to stress the kind of interface of European and non-European interaction, but also as a national museum to ensure that institutions in London, elite cultural institutions in London, are properly national. And in the lead up to the Brexit vote, I was still a Member of Parliament in Stoke-on-Trent, and the notion of disconnect between London and the rest of the country was profound. And it seems to me that national institutions have real responsibilities to make sure they're fulfilling their broader civic obligations. And so what we're doing in the V&A now is starting to teach, going back to our roots, and starting to teach design and technology GCSE, to actually give a literacy to all the stuff that we're describing today, to parts of the country where it's under threat. We've seen a 40% drop in the number of students taking design and technology GCSE over the last 7 years, particularly in disadvantaged areas, and particularly in the north of England. So beginning this term, we're teaching the new design and technology GCSE in Coventry and Blackburn, and then hopefully we're going to be in Stoke and Sheffield next year. And so there's, in a sense, it seems to me there's no point having these kind of sophisticated debates about the interaction of cosmopolitanism and European and non-European cultures and identities if you're not bringing the rest of the nation with you. And so we have to be, I think, that fulcrum for that. Not, you know, defending the values of cosmopolitanism. Absolutely, that's what museums are about. And if we lose that, we're stuffed. But making sure more people can join that conversation. Thank you.